I think you might have mentioned my question, but then is it safe to say Britain was the master of colonization, or where did the colonization ideology came about?
Good. Firstly, you're going to see a map which I've asked Caron to make a copy of. Firstly, in terms of territory, Britain, the French has more African territory. By 1925, simply territorially, but much of it is desert. Then it's Britain. In terms of human beings under control, it's British territory. Okay? Britain is. And by the First World War, and Britain, there's a saying that the sun never sets on the British Empire. What does that mean? The sun never sets because they are in the east and the west. So, all over Canada, these are all once British territories or possessions or protectorates or dominions, whatever. Australia was a dominion, it becomes a dominion territory, but it's all, so from the east to the west, the sun never sets on the British Empire. And then some clever African said, the sun never sets on the British Empire because God doesn't trust the British after dark. God doesn't trust the British after dark. So, no, certainly, this was the British imperialists will say the greatest empire the world has ever seen. Look at the English language. Look at the English language. The English language, so on the one hand, it's there for us to see in the dominance of the English language today. And the dominance of the English language. That little island could do this, from the 18th century is this high point when they take India they call India the crown, the jewel in the crown. Okay, India is very important to understand in the project. So India, Southern Africa, and the Caribbean. The Caribbean for the plantations and sugar. This is so important that we have become very interested in sugar because I don't want the children to have so much drinks and sugar and so on. But if you look at the growth of what is called the sweet tooth, people say I have a sweet tooth. I like cakes and I like sugary things. The growth of the people, the human beings naturally didn't have so much sugar. But there's a saying, what is the saying? What does Sidneyman say? In the 1650s, sugar was a luxury. In the 1750s, sugar was a luxury in the 60s. It was an absolute luxury. Sugar used to first come in a loaf, and the royalty used to receive it as a gift. So sugar was grown in many places in the world. In the North Africans, for instance, who presented to royalty their counterparts as a loaf, and it was like a thing that you really valued. People got sweet things, fructose from other things, honey and so on. 1650, it was an absolute luxury. 1750, it was a rarity, I think, and by 1850, it was a necessity. Can you see yourself now living? We can live without it, but it's just taken for granted. So sugar is this major thing, this commodity. I told you, think about objects, commodities, what we wear, the clothes we wear, the food we eat, and the utensils we use. All these things have to be made. Knives and forks. All these factories and these companies are in Britain. Cadbury's chocolate and cocoa, and the demand, it's a crucial factor. Lots of arguments have been made about the role of Cadbury in the abolition of slavery, because their cocoa was coming from here, and the alliance between this form of capital and the labor regimes that obtained. All these cities in London, Liverpool, Manchester. In fact, people used to call linen by certain places from Britain, or your Manchester ware or your silverware was associated. So it's very interesting. But there's one thing, where you can be pro-imperial, there's nostalgia for the British Empire. There is this nostalgia by the English and the British, the English themselves. Because remember, the English, before they colonized the rest of the world, they were already engaged in colonialism in that territory over the Irish. Their first colony was Ireland. And the problems between North and South Ireland and all that stuff it's a colonial issue. So the Irish will know a lot about colonialism because they have spoken of the British as colonialists. Irish, they speak their own language. The problems with Scotland now wanting independence. There's a great movie completely fictionalized about Scottish independence over the English. What's it called?
Braveheart.
Braveheart. It's completely fictionalized. But if you want to look at it, if you want to enjoy a great movie, so firstly, understand the English as itself and England. So don't confuse an Irish and a Scotsman and so on and so on. Or Welshman. So it's very different. We use it collectively at the British Isles. But there was a colonialism, maybe we can call it internal colonialism, in which English first had to spread there. And this is important, and when the British spread throughout the world, they spread English, but who did they take with them and who went? Often the poorest of the poor, the Irish. They sent prisoners to colonize Australia. And they sent the Scottish were amongst the earliest and the most eager to go all over the globe with them. And people basically saw opportunity. Many of the people they sent as settlers, they weren't there because they hated Africans and they wanted to civilize the Africans. They wanted a better life. They were dirt poor. They were from the working classes. Okay, so the poorest came, and they came to these territories. And in fact, as I said, 1800 was a turning point when they must have come to South Africa in the 1800s. The standards of living in the Eastern Cape was not that bad for the people in the Eastern Cape. In fact, they were doing very well in terms of their standard of living because they were independent farmers and they created the surplus and they traded with each other and so on. And when the settlers came, they saw, God, these people are not doing badly. We can have some of this. But of course, it was completely unjust because they didn't ask to come there.
So was the treatment of the British the same in Africa and also other colonies?
Very important, very important. Yeah, you guys, that's why we must look at history in a global frame. We must take Africa and look. That's why I wanted this course to be about Africa firstly, so we don't only talk about South Africa, but talk about South Africa in its African frame, and then talk about Africa in a global frame. Now, settler colonialism is what I said in Africa. We have settler colonialism here, we have settler colonialism the French did. But it happened earlier already, where the local population, in South Africa, the settlers didn't wipe out the indigenous people, isn't it? We are still here, you are still here. But in America, the British also, they wiped out the Indians. How much percent of America is now Indian? They are little. So here we have the first case of the British settling. And the British weren't the first to settle, by the way. The Dutch did. And the Spanish, of course, the Spanish did. Christopher Columbus came here. And Amerigo Vespucci, that's where the name America comes from. Then the British ultimately, because the basis of the British Empire was their strength as a sea power. This made them great. When the world depended on sea travel to get around, the British were the best. And when that finished, they were finished. When another form of transport became the way to dominate the world. Now it's space and drones and God knows what. It's no longer sea. The sea is important for moving goods and so on. But as a military power, they gradually pushed the Indians and pushed and basically had a genocide. So America is an example of a settler colony. The same with Australia, the virtual elimination of the indigenous people, the Aboriginal, they call it. And now there's accommodations and recognitions and historical recollections about it. You find this with the Maoris in New Zealand. So here we have it, Canada. Canada is the one place where you still have apparently 10% of the Indians are still there, and they're still very strong in terms of mobilizing. But it's coming back in all sorts of ways. If we're not looking at Russian expansion from the Tsars and so on, but Russia had also expanded into Central Asia. Okay? So there are Russians all over Central Asia, and Russians are spoken. And so when the Soviet Union was established, it was almost natural. They just continued the pattern of incorporating Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, and they became Soviets. But it was a longer pattern. So imperialism is not unique to the British. Okay, the French also. The French are also in the Caribbean. The French. There's a small island here in the Mayotte. Which is still part. If you go to Mayotte, an island here, you must get a French passport, a French visa. It's French territory. So they maintain small islands all over the world that they've seen to be important to maintain, to keep. But this story really, the whole inclusion of the world in single empires from 1492, Christopher Columbus, by around early 1500, if you could go from Spain to the Americas, to Lima, to Philippines, you could speak one language, Spanish. Okay? That's the connectedness of the world through one language. And then later on, English becomes that language. And later on, Chinese will be.
Yeah.